I'm going to show you how to make your very own sourdough starter right at home. Sourdough has risen in popularity over the past few years. You can find it in most of your artisan bakeries, but did you know it's just as easy to make at home? To make your own sourdough at home, you need a sourdough starter. This sourdough starter feeds off of wild yeast in the air and allows your bread to rise without using processed yeast. We're going to go through the process now and I'll show you every step. Be sure to subscribe as you won't want to miss out on any of the amazing sourdough recipes that we have coming your way using this starter. So there are a few tools that you'll need in your kitchen in order to make a sourdough starter. The most important are 2 glass jars. I like to start with 2 because at the beginning, it's easier to go back and forth between jars. Once your sourdough has matured, you can just use 1 jar. I've weighed my jars. This one is 395 grams and I've got 2 of the same. This is just in case while you're weighing out your ingredients, your scale happens to go back to 0. At least you'll know how much your jar weighs and then you can work out what your ingredients are. The reason I love these jars for this purpose is because they have a flat side. It allows you to see the rise and fall of the sourdough starter, and it also lets you scrape down the side as you're mixing it so that you can make sure it's all fully incorporated. These wet jars are my absolute favorite, and they're also available on Amazon. I've linked them down below. A set of scales is very important, and digital scales are key in this instance. They'll give you the most accurate read. You'll also need 800 grams, I know it's strange to measure water in grams, but 800 grams of water. Now I've measured this out so that I've got it ready for my entire process, and it's easier if you do that too. One thing to note about the water is that if you live somewhere where the water is chlorinated, you'll want that water to sit out overnight so the chlorination evaporates and your water doesn't have any in it. This can hamper the rise of your starter. I've used water straight from the tap in the UK and it's never been a problem before. We're using 2 different types of flour for this starter. We're using a regular white bread flour and we're using an organic rye flour. The reason this is important is the organic rye tends to really absorb that wild yeast a lot quicker than a regular bread flour. Saying that, you certainly can use just bread flour. It may just take slightly longer for your starter to have a consistent rise and fall. You can get the rye flour on Amazon if your local shop doesn't stock it. I've popped a link below. To one of my jars, we're going to add 100 grams of the rye flour. We're going to measure out 125 grams of our water. The reason I measure it out separately and I don't put it straight into the jar with the flour at this stage is we want to make sure the temperature is right. You'll want your water to be about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, about 27 degrees Celsius. So I'm going to pop it in the microwave just for a couple of seconds. If you haven't got a microwave, you can easily do this on the stove. Our water is now going into our jar. You'll want to give this a really good mix up so that it's all combined. Make sure you get all of those dry bits on the bottom. This is what it should look like. So you'll want to cover this, but you don't want to seal it. The great thing about these jars is they come with these little clips that normally hold down the lid to preserve things. Now I've removed the rubber ring from the lid and I'm going to put the clips on the side of the jar and just pop my lid on top. That allows just enough air to go in and out of the jar in order to allow the sourdough to feed. If you haven't got a lid like this or a jar like this, you can use a muslin cloth with an elastic band around the top, anything that allows some airflow through it, but you just don't want to seal it completely. We're going to set the jar aside for 24 hours. Now here is the step to make this really easy. We're going to weigh out our mixed flour combination and put it in another jar so that you're not constantly weighing out 2 different types of flour every day for the next 2 weeks. We're going to start with 300 grams of our organic rye flour into our jar. And to our rye, we'll add 300 grams of white bread flour. In typical Black Cat Kitchen fashion, I've used too small a jar, so I'll move it over to a larger jar and make sure I stir it all up together. Give it a bit of a shake or a stir. Just make sure it's all really well combined so that you've got even amounts of both flour. The reason I measure this out and mix it all now is it makes it so much easier than at first thing in the morning when you're trying to get your sourdough fed. Once it's all weighed out, you just need to take whatever measurement you need from this jar. You don't have to worry about measuring from 2 different bags of flour. And I'll see you in 24 hours. Here we are back for day 2. You may notice a bit of a change in your sourdough starter today. You may have even got a nice rise on it. Mine hasn't risen up yet, but it has a nice fruity smell, so I know those wild yeasts are starting to activate. To our clean jar, we're going to add 100 grams of our flour. I've already heated up my water to 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees centigrade. We've got 115 grams here, and that's going into this jar as well. I've set my scales to 0, and now we're going to put 75 grams of the starter from yesterday into the clean jar. And just like yesterday, we're going to stir this all together until it's fully combined. So that's nice and incorporated. And just like yesterday, we're going to make sure the sides are as clean as possible, pop the lid back on, and leave it for another 24 hours. I know it seems wasteful to throw this discard away, but because it's so new, it hasn't got anything of value to baking or cooking yet. So the best thing to do is get rid of this, and once we have a stable starter, I'll show you exactly what you can do with your discards. It's day 3 and our starter is really starting to show some life. Let's check it out. Look how much it's risen up since yesterday. And you've got some really nice bubbles on the top, and you can see them starting to form up through the side here as well. That's really what we're looking for on day 3. You may have had this on day 2 if your kitchen is really warm, but this is the perfect stage for this to be at. And if you smell it, mine kind of smells like overripe fruit, almost like a banana that's been left out a little bit too long. That's exactly what you're looking for here. So now on to the feeding. Day 3 is exactly the same measurements as day 2. Tomorrow's process will be slightly different. Instead of feeding it every 24 hours, we're going to feed it every 12 hours. And that allows us a more consistent rise and fall in our starter. We'll want to be a little bit more precise with knowing the rise and fall at this point. So I'm going to take an elastic band and just put it where the top of the starter is sitting. That way tomorrow when I come back, I can see how much it's risen. See you tomorrow for day 4. It's day 4. We've had a bit of rise here, which is great, and it's been 24 hours. Now the next step is feeding it every 12 hours. So we're going to feed it now, and we're going to feed it again in 12 hours time. You may notice at this point, mine hasn't got one, but you may notice some liquid on the top of your starter. That's known as hooch. That is completely normal, and you just want to give that a stir back in. So just like the past 3 days, we're going to use 100 grams of our flour mix, 115 grams of our water, which has been warmed up, and 75 grams of our starter. The reason why we're feeding it at this stage twice in a day, every 12 hours, is because the starter is now becoming hungrier. That means you're going to get more rise and more fall from each feed. That allows you to make sure that your starter is very strong and that you can make a really good solid bread. In goes our water, and then give your starter a bit of a little stir just to make sure it's all combined, and then again 75 grams. Now today is the last day we're going between jars, so we can leave it in this jar from this point onwards, and this is why we've actually weighed the jars out, and I'll show you more of that when we do the next feed in 12 hours time. So I put the band back around it to mark its height, and like I said, we'll leave this for another 12 hours. Now, sourdough starters have been in use for a really long time. There are some sourdough starters still in use today that are hundreds of years old and have just been fed over the years in certain bakeries. These breads really have a beautiful flavor. They're really rich, and you can really taste the depth of the sourdough starter. Now, your sourdough starter, when you've just started it, may not have that depth, but you're still going to get that nice tangy flavor from your sourdough. So we've had a good think about what to call this starter. And we've decided, since we love cats, we're going to call it Cleopatra. I still wouldn't use the discard at this point for any recipes. It's not quite stable enough. You may have some wild yeast in there that isn't fully fermented, and it could cause some upset tummies. It also isn't going to taste very nice. It's going to have a very vinegary taste, and that's not going to be nice in any of your baking or cooking. It's day 7 of our starter. It has a very yeasty, bready, beery smell to it, which is what we're looking for at this stage. Now, we haven't had quite the rise that I would like to get on this starter, so we're going to continue going with the feeding, and we're not quite ready to use it yet. But I know it's living and I know it's working because it has that little bit of rise and there's a nice amount of bubbles on top. I'm really excited to be sharing this sourdough journey with you. So if you're struggling with getting your starter up and running, leave a comment down below and we're gonna help troubleshoot to figure out what's wrong with your starter and why it isn't giving you the life that it should be. So it's day 7. We want our starter to work a little bit harder now so that we can make sure to get that nice rise. So we've been feeding it quite a lot. We want to feed it slightly less so that we can really force that rise in the starter. So we want to get our starter back to 75 grams. You can see even the consistency of my starter has changed quite a bit. Now we're going to add 50 grams of our flour. At this point, you can just use white flour, white bread flour if you'd like. You don't have to continue with the rye. However you feel you want to make your sourdough, rye will give it a different flavor than just plain white flour. And to this, we're going to add 50 grams of water. So they're equal parts water and flour at this stage. Give that a good stir. And because we've used less water today, you'll find it's a little bit stiffer, and that's what we want. Scrape down the sides of your container. Again, trying to keep it as clean as possible, just to promote a healthy starter. I'm going to reset my elastic band because obviously it will be significantly lower this time because we put a lot less flour and water in there. We're going to set that aside for another 12 hours. It's day 14 of Cleopatra's life. We've been feeding her every 12 hours in the same increment that I showed you on day 7. You can see she has a really healthy rise on her. She smells like beer and bread, which is perfect. And she's ready to go to make some beautiful sourdough bread. Make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell because I'll be showing you exactly how you can use your starter as well as your discard in recipes coming up ahead.